Welcome to Journey Through the Gate, your paranormal portal podcast, as we delve into the many questions and wonders brought on by the supernatural experience. What's on the other side of the gate? Let's find out together. Tonight, grip your lanterns tight as we are guided on this journey by a gentleman known for his historically passionate ghost tales, an award-winning tour guide and author of ghostly tales of the unexpected. In Victorian fare, he will lead us over cobblestone roads recounting stories of Jack the Ripper, the Pendle witches, and tales from the grave. Please welcome one of Britain's finest storytellers, Mr. Simon Entwistle. Thank you, Simon, for coming on.
Pleasure is all mine.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I know it is very early where you are, and tell us a little bit about where you're from and the things all around you. Get us kind of in the mood there, because a lot of our listeners are all around the world, but it helps to know a little bit about your hometown.
Sure. I live in the north of England, in a county called Lancashire.
Mm.
It's quite a large county. The capital town is Preston, and the city of Lancaster. And I've been a professional tour guide now since 1996.
Mm.
And there's nothing I like more than conducting guided ghost, murder, and mystery tours. There's a whole array of stories out there. There's nothing I like more than bringing the stories to life, really.
Oh, gosh, and you do it so well, Simon. I'm looking at pictures now on the website of its Top Hat Tours, is it not?
That's quite correct. tophattours.co.uk.
And they sure know how to put on a tour from everything that I've heard, and it just sounds absolutely fabulous. And just the surroundings, you're absolutely seeping with history, and
Well, yeah. But sorry, Cisco.
no, no, go ahead.
I, I live very, very near a world famous hill called Pendle Hill.
Ah,
And way back in the year 1612, we had this king called King James the Sixth of Scotland,
mm,
who then became King James the First of England. And this man was absolutely paranoid about witchcraft. He not only believed that witches existed, he believed they were actually out to get him. On becoming King of England, he wrote a book called The Demonology Book. Today you can buy the Demonology book in paperback form, and it covers his paranoia relating to witchcraft. As you pick the book up, how to find a witch, how to try a witch, and most important, how to eradicate a witch.
mm,
Throughout the whole length of the Great Britain, the hill surrounding the town where I live is called Clitheroe, Lancashire. It's this rather beautiful hill called Pendle Hill. And in 1612, surrounding that hill would have been a very, very deep, deep forest. Living in the forest were two very, very elderly women, Demdike and Chattox. When I say elderly women, both of them were over 85 years old. They'd somehow um, defied the laws of nature because life expectancy in 1612 would have been 35 if you were lucky.
mm.
In the case of Demdike, she lived in a little hovel. When I say hovel, it would be a one-roomed building made of limestone called Malkin Tower. She'd lost her husband, but she did have her children with her daughter Elizabeth and her grandchildren, James, Jeanette, and Alison, and they lived in this little hovel in the centre of the forest. Living nearby was Bessie Chattox, also 85 years old. She had lost her daughter, but she lived in Newchurch in Pendle, a little village quite nearby. These were the main Pendle witches. But our story really starts way back on the 18th of March, 1612, when young Alison Device, 14 years old, the granddaughter of Demdike, had a walk through the forest. She had the misfortune, and it really was misfortune, of meeting a Halifax peddler called John Law. When I say peddler, John Law was basically a walking salesman. He had a large pack in his back full of 1612 luxuries. He would go from village to village within the forest of Pendle, selling his wares, but he was also, in many ways, a walking newspaper, a great source of information. He met young Alison deep in the forest, and Alison begged, "Oh, please, sir, you can spare a few pence to pin me clothing together, sir, can't you? Get away with you. I'm not taking my pack off for you, lass. You've got no money. Oh, please, sir, just a few pence, sir. Get away with you. I'm not taking my pack off for you. You've got no money, lass." According to John Law, out of the forest came a huge black dog with snarling white teeth and glowing red eyes, and the dog sat right next to Alison, and the dog talked. "Alison, shall I lame him for you?" Lame him, she screamed. John Law felt a piercing pain in his left arm, his left leg, and the left-hand side of his face, and collapsed in agony in the forest of Pendle. The kind people of the small town of Cone in North Pendle, they could see him, and they got a stretch team together, and they carried him down the slopes of Pendle Hill and into an old alehouse called the Greyhound Inn, which has long, long since gone. There the landlord, John Edrington, looked after him. As Law's voice returned, Law shouted, "I've been cursed! There's a witch in the forest, a young lass. She's got a dog with her, and I swear to you, I heard the dog talk. She's in league with devil. Send letters back to me family." Letters were sent back to Halifax, and John Law's eldest son Abraham received the first letter. Me father's in trouble. I better go and collect him." He set off from Halifax, arrived in the small market town of Cone, and walked into the old Greyhound Inn and saw his father in a twisted and contorted state. "Father, what's happened to you, man? You look terrible." "Abraham, I've been cursed. I met a young lass in the forest. She's a witch. She's got a dog with her. I swear to you, Abraham, I heard the dog talk. She's in league with the devil. I want you, lad, to go into the forest, find her, and bring her here." Well, Abraham must have been a very brave lad. He set off and walked deep into the forest of Pendle, through these twisting pathways, and there, deep in the forest, he came across this cottage called Malkin Tower. He hammered on the door opened, and there was James Devise, Alison's younger brother. "Can I help you, sir?" "I want to see Alison Devise. My father wants to see her." "She's near, sir." Alison came to the door. "Right, lass, you're coming with me," shouted Abraham, and she was dragged through the forest, down into the town of Cone, and into the old Greyhound Inn. There, John Law looked up from his sick bed. It's you, you're witch. You cursed me, lass, that dog you had. I heard it talk. You're in league with devil, aren't you?" This 14-year-old girl, on bended knees, burst into tears and admitted to witchcraft. She had no idea. She just admitted to a state capital offence of witchcraft. Strangely enough, John Law, the Halifax peddler, was about to forgive her, but not his son Abraham. "Oh no, we'll have you for this. I'm going to go and get the local magistrate." Now, the local magistrate was called Roger Nowell. He lived at a beautiful place called Reed, near Burnley in East Lancashire. He was the magistrate. He was a very wealthy man and lived in this beautiful hall called Reed Hall. He also was fully aware of the king's paranoia relating to witchcraft, and he also knew if he could incriminate this young girl, he was going to curry favour with the King of England, King James, personally. So therefore, he gave orders that Alison should be arrested. She was brought to Reed Hall, and there for the second time, inside 24 hours, she burst into tears and admitted to witchcraft. But she gave Roger Nowell, the magistrate, a lot more information. "Me grandmother, dem type, she's a witch. So's Bessie Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern. We have these dogs, sir. Tib, Ball, Fancy, Dandy. They're our familiars, sir." "Familiars?" said Roger Nowell. "Yes, sir. These dogs, they came to us at different times of our lives and said, look, they talked to us, sir. They said, we can give you special powers, but in return, we need to suckle from your flesh and take your souls. They're our familiars, sir. We get powers off them. We also go to New Church Cemetery, sir, in the dead of night. We dig up corpses, sir. We take hair and teeth off the corpses, sir, and we make clay pictures of human beings. We then select a victim. We then crumble the clay picture over the fire, sir, and people die, sir. Roger Noel, the magistrate, was actually not scared. He was delighted because he had a confession and he knew he was indeed going to curry favour with the King of England personally. So therefore, he gave orders that Demdike, Chattox, and Redfern should also be arrested. They were brought to Reed Hall, Burn, where they met young Alison, and this huge argument took place. They all tried to blame each other, but in doing so, they all admitted to acts of witchcraft and grave robbery. The four of them were then sent to the city of Lancaster to Lancaster City Castle Jail. They were thrown into what's called the Well Tower, a very, very deep, deep underground dungeon, which is still there to this very, very day. There they were chained to the floor in complete darkness, and there they would have to wait for 4 very, very long months in cold, damp, totally dark conditions. In the meantime, in the forest of Pendle, at the stone cottage called Malkin Tower, Elizabeth Devise was very, very worried about her mother, Demdike, and indeed her daughter Alison, and she organised on Good Friday 1612 what's called the Good Friday meeting, where all the witches of the area converged in the forest of Pendle at Malkin Tower. Alison's brother James slaughtered the sheep for the fell. They dined on mutton. They got a large cooking vessel called a cauldron, and they lit a fire beneath the cauldron, and the black syrupy liquid inside began to bubble and steam. And into that black bubbling liquid went crushed, powdered human teeth, and indeed the odd clay pitcher and the odd human scalp. The whole idea was to get a potion together to blow the gates of Lancaster City Castle open and rescue their loved ones. However, nothing happened. What did happen is word of this meeting reached the ears of Roger Noel, the local magistrate, and he gave orders that every single person who had attended the Good Friday meeting should be arrested immediately. When word filtered into the forest of Pendle that these people were going to be arrested, a few people thought, there's no way I'm going to hang around, and they disappeared. But in doing so, they saved their lives. The ones that were successfully arrested were as follows: Jeanette Preston of Gisborne, West Yorkshire; Catherine Hewitt and Alice Gray of the market town of Combe; Elizabeth Devise, James Devise, Jeanette Devise of Malkin Tower, Pendle Forest. Catherine Hewitt was also brought in from Combe once again, along with John and Jane Bulcott, a mother and son from the village of Blackoe, deep in the forest, and this very, very brave lady called Alice Nutter. They were all sent to Lancaster, with the exception of the 2 Jeanettes. Jeanette Preston came from Gisborne, West Yorkshire, so therefore she was sent to the city of York and paraded in front of the York city magistrates. Her husband went with her, villagers went with her, and they begged for her release. However, the judges said, we're very sorry. The king signed her death warrant before she even arrived. The accusations against her were attending the Good Friday meeting in Lancaster, but also, sadly, the murder of her employer, Mr. Thomas Lister. She'd been nursing him. He had died. She wrapped his body in a clean white sheet ready for burial, and 2 days before the burial, some fresh blood came through the sheets. This was classed as witchcraft. She was found guilty of witchcraft and became the very, very first of the Pendle witches to be executed by hanging in the city of York on the 27th of July, 1612. In the meantime, the others are being held in the city of Lancaster, with the exception of the youngest of the Devise children, young Jeanette, whilst her grandmother Demdike, her mother Elizabeth, her brother James and sister Alison had been sent to Lancaster. She'd been kept at the local magistrate's home at Reed Hall, Burnley, and for the very, very first time in her life, she was given 3 meals a day, a warm bed to sleep in, and also some very, very nice clothes to wear. She had no idea at the time, but her evidence was going to play a very, very big important role in the trials. The King of England, King James, heard about the trial and sent some circuit judges. James Altham, Edmund Bromley, a young boy called Thomas Potts, whose job was to record everything the witches said in their defence. And when I say defence, they had none whatsoever. Along with the two circuit judges and Thomas Potts arrived Roger Nowell, the local magistrate, and two other magistrates, William Holden and John Bannister. There was no defence counsel because no one dared defend them, particularly when the king was indeed going to prosecute. The trials began on the 17th of August, 1612. Demdike died before the trials began. She defied the gallows at the very last minute. However, she did admit to witchcraft, and she did admit to grave robbery, the removal of hair and teeth from corpses, and making clay pictures of human beings, and crumbling the clay pictures over a fire, and people were dying of mysterious ailments. Bessie Chattox was brought up, but she actually admitted to the murder of 5 local people by again making the clay dolls and crumbling them. Elizabeth Devise admitted to witchcraft. So did James Devise. So did Alison Devise. So did Catherine Hewitt. However, there were 3 people in the courts that day that didn't, and this is where the story gets quite exciting, really. Way back in 1612, in the United Kingdom, women had no rights whatsoever. In fact, it was believed by some men that women didn't even have a brain. And when it came to male chauvinism, women in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland suffered terribly. They had no rights whatsoever. Living at the foot of Pendle Hill in 1612 was an exceptionally brave woman called Alice Nutter. Alice could read and she could write. She was a very wealthy woman. And she lived with her husband Miles in a beautiful hall called Roughly Hall on the side of Pendle Hill. She owned a lot of land with her husband, and she got very, very annoyed one day when other landowners were pushing her fencing back, pushing her stone walls back, and she was losing cattle and sheep. And she said to her husband, look, I'm a woman, I can't complain, but you need to go to the courts in Lancaster to get our land disputes sorted. I'm too scared. He said, I'll go. Alice made the very brave decision of walking to Lancaster and walking for the castle gates in Lancaster into a court session. She heard the words, it's a woman, get out, it's a woman, how dare she walk in here? Alice grabbed hold of furniture. The prison wardens tried to tug her away from the furniture, but she would not let go of her grip. And the judges said, well, let her have her say. In one afternoon, Alice Nutter won all her land disputes fairly and squarely. But in court that day was Roger Nowell, and he thought, this woman has really embarrassed me. I need to get rid of her. Along with John and Jane Bulcock, a mother and son, who are also landowners, who are also complaining about land disputes. I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I have these people in the forest of Pendle who have admitted to witchcraft. I've got these 3 farmers who are causing me lots of trouble. I could get rid of them by using my star trump card, Jeanette Devise. Young Jeanette had been groomed by him. She'd been kept in his home for 4 months. She had enjoyed the luxury of having a warm bed, nice clothes to wear, and 3 meals a day. And after this marvellous treatment, she was only too happy to incriminate her whole family. Roger Nowell picked her up and put her on top of a desk so the jury could see her at the courts in Lancaster. There she shouted, "Me grandmother's a witch! Me mother's a witch! So's me brother, so's me sister, so's Catherine Hewitt." And then Roger Nowell pointed at John and Jane Bulcock and Alice Nutter. "Jeanette, these 3 people here, were they at the Good Friday meeting at your home in the Forest of Pendle on Good Friday at Malkin Tower?" "They were, sir." A look of shock and horror came across Alice's face, John and Jane, as they realised they were indeed being incriminated for witchcraft. They made a plea of not guilty. In the case of Alice Nutter, she was found guilty of aiding Demdike and Alison Devise in the murder of Henry Mitten of Roughly because he wouldn't give her a penny. In court, she said, "Look, I don't need to beg. I'm a woman of wealth. I don't even know these people. But to use a modern term, a very modern term, she had indeed been stitched up by the local magistrate, along with John and Jane, the mother and son, who were also farmers in the area. They were found guilty of turning a young girl called Jean Mead completely insane in the town of Harrogate in West Yorkshire. The Pendle witches were then led out to the pillory at Lancaster. They had their hands tied behind their back. They had to mount what's called a rostrum. The ropes were placed around their necks, and they stood on what we call a trestle. The trestles were kicked up underneath them, and these poor people did not hang. They literally strangled to death. As the rope was placed round Alice's neck, she bravely turned and watched this huge crowd gather. And as she looked down into the crowd, she saw Roger Nowell, the magistrate, holding the hand of young Jeanette. And she shouted, "I shall haunt you for the rest of your life." Then the stools were kicked up underneath them. Watching that day was young Jeanette. She watched her whole family perish, and the farmers as well. She was holding the hand of Roger Nowell, and as soon as they stopped twitching the pillory, Nowell said, "Goodbye." She said, "What do you mean, goodbye? Am I not going back to that lovely home of yours, to the warm bed, the 3 meals a day, and the nice clothes? Goodbye." He had used them, and she made the long, long journey home by herself to a cold and empty cottage deep in the forest of Pendle, knowing full well that her evidence had claimed the life of her entire family and indeed the three local farmers. As for Roger Nowell, the following day he made his way down to the city of London, where he was knighted by King James' person and made the High Sheriff of Lancashire. Thomas Potts, the clerk of the courts, he wrote a book called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire, which earned him an absolute fortune, and you can buy that book today in paperback. It's a very, very tragic story, Cisco, but I'm sure that if Steven Spielberg got his teeth into this story, he would have a Hollywood thriller.
Absolutely. What a story, Simon. What a story. What a tragic story for that poor young girl. Did you say she was 14?
She was indeed 14 years old.
Oh,
Uh, it was really, horrific the way women were treated in those days. They had no rights whatsoever, and were really treated like second-class citizens, if you.
absolutely. And I know that was around the whole world. It seems like they had that whole witchcraft, almost like a wildfire that went through, and so many innocents were hung, and it's horrible the way.
Really, really is,
Yeah.
Cisco. And of course, in your wonderful country, many years later, when of course America was a British colony, in
Hmm.
Salem, Massachusetts, they had another witch trial, and again at Salem, the British courts there brought in a young girl, and it was believed in those days that children were completely innocent, and of course they believed every word that a child would say because they believed they couldn't be manipulated or in any way, shall we say, swayed by a jury.
Just that is absolutely amazing, and just to walk through um, that hill and that area and know that that happened there is just it's wow, quite a story, quite a story. But you have that all around you. I mean, it
Oh yes, yeah.
seems silly to say there's so much history here because there's history everywhere.
Oh
But
yes, without a doubt.
yes, when you walk the streets that you get to walk down and give your tours and tell those wonderful stories, it's just there's just so much to gather from, you know.
Yeah, what I tend to do nowadays, of course, is I have a minibus.
Uh-huh.
We can get, shall I say, about 25, 30 people on the minibus, and we go to all the areas associated with the Pendlewich trial, including the fabulous Lancaster City Castle. And it has the old courtrooms are still there. It has the dungeons where they were kept. And you can really, really bring the whole story to life, really.
Mm.
It is a tragic story, but of course, in those days, a lot of superstition. And really, the local magistrate, he wanted to curry favour with the King of England. He wanted to. And that's exactly what he did do. Of course, he was knighted and made the High Sheriff as well. So he'd have a huge increase in wages as well. But Alice, for me, is a bit of a heroine, really. She's obviously a very brave lady who stood up for her rights. Well, she had none at all, of course, but in 2012, we unveiled a statue to her in her village 400 years later, and
Wow.
she's become very, very much a symbol of female rights. Very
Good
much
for
a
her.
symbol of female rights, yeah.
Good for her. That's just absolutely amazing, Simon. Just wow. I'm just staggered back because you bring it to such life, and my heart right now is reaching out for that poor little girl who was basically swindled, but so many people climb that ladder of nobility and power on other people's backs.
Very
There's
true.
so many stories like that. So many. Wow. And see, here I was, I never, all the times I've read about witches and things like that, I'd heard the name, but I had no idea the depth of the story. Thank you for bringing that to life for us. That's quite amazing. Now, I know you have an awful lot of uh, pubs and fantastic places like that there too. Or do you have any haunted pubs that you know of?
Oh, gosh, Cisco, yeah, I do what's called the Ribble Valley Haunted Inns. Um, there's nothing I like more, really, than visiting a very, very old inn.
Mm,
And here in the United Kingdom, we have a place called Stratford-on-Avon, um, where Shakespeare, of course, was born. And there's a lovely old inn there called the Garrick, and the Garrick dates back to 1595. It's made completely of wood. It's made completely of wood, and of course, the wood is preserved because it's one of the oldest public houses in England.
mm.
But I love pubs with stories, and this is very, very much an affair of the heart ghost story. We're going to go to a very, very beautiful village, not too far from where I live, called Chipping. And in Chipping this very day, you will come across a lovely old inn, a public house called the Sun Inn, and the Sun Inn was built in 1758. But we're going to turn the clock back now to 1855, and a young girl from the City of London called Elizabeth Dean. Lizzie, as she was known, made her way from the City of London up to Lancashire to look for work, and she made her way into the Sun. And the landlord, John Nicholson, took one look at Lizzie and said, "If you'd like a job here, my dear, I'll give you a job right away because you're a very attractive young lady and you will bring a lot of custom into my public house." So she thought, well, that sounds great. And she was given a job as a scullery maid. Now, she had a very good friend who was a fellow scullery maid called Alicia Trainer. And these two really became very, very close friends. One day, a handsome young lad called David came into the Sun Inn, took one look at Lizzie, and became besotted by her beauty. Within 3 days, he actually proposed to her. And quite surprisingly, Lizzie had only known him for 3 days, but she said, "Yes, I will marry you." Well, right next to the Sun is St. Bartholomew's Church. The two of them made their way to see the Reverend, and they planned their happy, happy wedding day. Lizzie went back to work with a skip in her step. She was away from the smog and smoke of London, living in this beautiful West Yorkshire village, fresh air, gorgeous cottage to live in, a nice job, and a handsome young husband to look forward to. However, 2 days before the marriage, David got cold feet and sat down with Lizzie. Lizzie, I'm really sorry, Lizzie. I don't want to marry you, my love, but I would like to marry your best friend, Alicia. You could imagine the poor girl's heart was snapped in two. She was deeply, deeply wounded by that statement. And you can also imagine her relationship with Alicia wasn't very pleasant afterwards. When they made the bed, Alicia and Lizzie would turn their backs on each other. On the day of the wedding, poor Lizzie Dean made her way up to the attic of the Sun Inn, which overlooks St. Bartholomew's Church. She watched the groom arrive, and then she watched the bride arrive. Sadly, she made a terrible decision that day to terminate her life. She removed the window cord sashing from the window. She made a noose for herself, and she tied the end of the cord to the end of the bedstead and then she shuffled onto the window frame, dangling her legs out of the window, and she tied the rope around her neck. She then heard the sound of the wedding march emanating from the church. As the church door opened and Lizzie and David came out arm in arm with the wedding party, Lizzie jumped. She broke her neck cleanly and efficiently against the wall of the Sun Inn, and as David and Lizzie left the church, they looked up and saw Lizzie hanging there. Of course, you can imagine the atmosphere was
Mm.
deeply, deeply upsetting. The landlord got a ladder and climbed up the ladder and cut poor Lizzie down. In her clenched fist was a suicide note saying, "I wish to be buried at the entrance to St. Bartholomew's, so that when David and Lizzie go to church, they'll have to walk past my grave and feel remorse for what they've done to me." And Lizzie is indeed, to this very day, buried at the entrance to St. Bartholomew's. However, her ghost has been seen by many, many people inside the Sun Inn. British, American, Canadian team have all been to the Sun Inn. Way back in 1999, I received a telephone call from a gentleman from Edinburgh in Scotland. He said that he had been on holiday in the area, and he hired a car and took his wife and three children for a trip around the beautiful West Riding of Yorkshire, a lovely, beautiful area. He parked his car in Chipping, and his wife and three daughters, they made their way to a show home, a factory that was making chairs and tables. He thought, "I fancy a pint of beer." And he made his way inside the Sun Inn, sat down, and in those days you could smoke in public houses. He got his pipe out, and he stoked the pipe up with tobacco, lit the pipe, and looked up. And there in the corner of the room, he saw a young girl with ringlets in her hair from an era that had long, long since gone by. He noted that she was wearing a dress that looked like it had been washed thousands of times, almost like a psychedelic type dress, if you will. He tried to make vocal contact, but to no avail. She just stared into space. She then turned and walked towards him. To his horror, she walked straight for the table he was sitting at and out of the blocked door in the side of the old Sun Inn. He screamed in terror. He rushed next door. Stephen, the landlord, came rushing down the stairs and said, "Don't worry, don't worry. I know what you've just seen. You've seen the ghost of Lizzie Dean. She's been with us since the 5th of November, 1855. And Lizzie to this very day still haunts the old Sun Inn."
My. Hmm. I don't know what I'd do if I saw something like that. Oh my, that's something else. That
It's
is
a beautiful old inn. It really is a gorgeous inn. Of course, these pubs do have great stories behind them. They really do. And,
absolutely.
village pubs is where, of course, all the villagers would meet. But over the centuries,
It's just wow. And the buildings almost seem to remember, whether they're haunted or not, whether they have somebody who, a ghostly apparition that shows up all the time. You can almost, if you're real quiet, hear them. The walls
oh,
remember,
very,
and
very much so.
it's
Uh, I
amazing.
find in, I find in my job, when I conduct a variety of ghost walks throughout Lancashire, Yorkshire, and Cumbria. And I find one of the best ways to go is to actually talk to local people, get their stories. And you can always tell when someone is being very, very honest. And you can always tell when someone is, shall I say, to use a British term, pulling your leg, actually making a bit of fun of you, really. But one of my tours does take me to a beautiful, beautiful city called the City of York, which is in the beautiful county of Yorkshire. And this is a great story, which I know that listeners will really enjoy. It's a very true story and a very, very honest one. We're going to turn the clock back now to 1952. And for many of your listeners who may have been to the United Kingdom, there's a gorgeous building called York Minster. It's a
Mm.
huge Gothic cathedral in the centre of the town. Behind the Minster is a beautiful 1595 building called the Treasurer's House. Now, in 1952, working in the cellar of the Treasurer's House was a young chap called Harry Martindale. Harry was 18 years old. He was a plumber's apprentice. He had a blowtorch, and he was actually installing central heating. The blowtorch, of course, had a flame, and he was bending copper piping to install central heating. It was a Tuesday afternoon, October 1952, when he became aware of the sound of a trumpet that got louder and louder. And as he turned to his right, out of the wall of the cellar appeared a beautiful white horse with a Roman soldier on it that galloped past him. This was followed by platoon after platoon of Roman infantry. He could only see them up to their knees, and each soldier looked to be emaciated, very, very thin. Now, Harry was horrified. He scuttled into the corner of the cellar and cowered in fear. But he noticed that these Roman soldiers couldn't even see him. In fact, one or two of them actually walked straight through him. They were slightly dark skinned, very, very thin, and they looked absolutely miserable. As the last Roman soldier walked past him, the sound of the trumpet faded through the wall. Harry swallowed deep and ran upstairs and told his boss. His boss said, "No, no, no, Harry, get back down there. We've got to finish the work. We're under contract to finish the central heating contract." "I can't," said Harry. His boss said, "Well, I'm sorry. I've got to sack you." Harry was deeply upset. He walked for the city of York and popped into this lovely old inn called the Old Star. As he made his way up to the bar, he needed a stiff drink, and standing by the bar was a young lad from the York Evening Press, the local evening newspaper, whose words were, "Here, mate, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Actually," said Harry, "I've seen about 85 this afternoon." "Oh, that sounds great. Tell me about it," said the press journalist. So Harry told him the story, and the journalist thought, well, it's getting towards Halloween. It sounds like a good story. I'll print it. The story was printed, and when it was printed, the city of York laughed at young Harry. He was the butt of many a joke. However, 2 weeks later, no one joked whatsoever, because some more work had to take place in the cellar. They had to remove a lot more soil, and at the area where Harry had seen his Roman soldiers, they saw a Roman road in remarkably good condition. And next to the Roman road, they came across a huge stone tablet with the beautiful Roman numerals hammered into it and the words Eberach, the garrison of York. They'd found the garrison of York. Uh, and of course, 2,000 years previously, York was indeed one of the capitals of the Roman Empire with a huge garrison of Roman soldiers. Now, the local professors from the university went to see Harry and they sat down with him and he discussed what he'd seen. And he said these soldiers were very, very thin. They wore a leather kilt, they had round shields and a spear, and they looked to be emaciated. And many people believe that what Harry saw that day was somehow a time warp. With his blowtorch and his copper piping, he'd somehow opened a time warp into another era and another time. And many people believe that what Harry saw that day was the Ninth Hispanic Legion leaving the city of York for Scotland, and they were wiped out to a man by the Celts, the Scots. And of course, Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian, he actually built a wall uh, in the north of England to stop the Scots from invading England. And that wall is still there this very, very day. It's the most amazing story, Cisco.
That is so amazing. That is so amazing. And I heard that every once in a while, they see a Roman soldier inside, still standing guard and surprising guests of dinner parties and things like that.
It has happened.
Isn't that
Yes,
amazing?
it has happened. In fact, there's one part in the 1930s where a lady was looking for the toilets, what we call the loo, if you will, and she said it was a fancy dress party. She said, "Who's that really amazing Roman soldier?" They said, "Well, there's no Roman soldiers here in dress." So that was just another story relating to it, really. So
That's
yes,
amazing. And I think in a lot of ways we hear an awful lot of ghost soldiers that are still fighting the war that they died in, and they're still standing guard or they're still fighting those battles. And I can imagine all over Britain it is going on. So many battles rage there, and so many castles and old buildings still standing. We we don't have that as much of that in the U.S. I think everything was much newer, of course. Just being built. We're only a little over 200 years old now, right? But
Yes.
you guys go back thousands of years. I mean, how old did you say that one bar that's still standing? Since when? That's amazing.
Oh, gosh, gosh. Well, the in the city of York, the Minster, that dates back to around 1210,
It's amazing.
and the bar in Stratford-on-Avon called the Garrick, that dates back to around 1535. It's made of wood. It's made of oak, and even in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, they realised it was so of great historical value. So
Right.
therefore, it was put with pitch and tar to preserve the wood. But the beams they date back to that period of time. It's like walking into a time machine, if you
Absolutely. That's an awful lot of pints served. That's just over.
will. Very, very much so. Very much so.
That's
Yes.
absolutely amazing. Boy, I'll tell you, sir, it must be a lovely thing to walk through a tour with you. I would just absolutely love that. And if anybody's thinking about going out there, this gentleman, I had said in the beginning, does the Top Hat tours. He does spooky tours, of course, the Pendle Witch. And if you're really lucky, you can get in on the Jack the Ripper tour. Now, I don't know if I'd be brave enough to go on that one. I don't know. You make it come to life, and I don't know if I'd want to see where Jack the Ripper. Wasn't that in Whitechapel?
Was indeed. It's the most intriguing story, really, Cisco,
Amazing.
because none of us actually know who Jack the Ripper was. There's been many, many, many stories written about this person, but it is an intriguing story. First of all, Jack the Ripper must have been a very, very nasty piece of work.
Mm,
He was very, very athletic. He knew the area of London very, very well. He could somehow disappear into the darkness, but he was never, ever detected. But if we turn the clock back in time to 1888, there was an area called Whitechapel in London. It was densely, densely populated and was really known as outcast London. What is quite surprising is on the other side of the River Thames, you have the the real powerhouse of London, which is the Bank of England. And in 1888, that was one of the most wealthiest places on the planet. And just a short distance away, this area called Whitechapel was called Outcast London. Living in Whitechapel in an area that would have been better suited to, shall I say, 20,000 people. 100,000 people crammed into small buildings. The vast majority of those people had come in from Eastern Europe, Russian, Romanian, and Polish Jews. Now, they'd come from Eastern Europe to escape persecution in their countries and arrived in the city of London to seek their wealth. But they'd all crammed into this one small area, and it was quite common for, shall I say, 15 people sharing a house that was designed for, shall I say, 4 people. So it was densely, densely populated. Now, the locals, the original people living in Whitechapel, they really didn't like this new influx of people because they were causing lots of problems. They were starting their own businesses. They were quite greedy people in some ways, and there's a lot of tension, a lot of tension. So the area was really classed as outcast London. But our story starts way back on the 31st of August 1888 when a young lady of the name of Polly Ann Nichols, she was living in Whitechapel. Now, Polly was an alcoholic. Her husband had left her. She'd had a terrible background, really. She had 2 deformed children,
oh,
and her husband had actually thrown her out because of her drinking problems. Now, of course, in those days, there was no Department of Health and Social Security. So if you didn't work, you didn't eat. And by far one of the most quickest ways to earn money would be to go into prostitution. Now, in Whitechapel, you had 100,000 people living, and out of those 100,000 people, there was at least 1,500 permanently unemployed and permanently unhoused. So there's what we call the DOS house. Now, you could sleep in a DOS house. You could actually literally lean over a rope. You'd be undercover, but you'd actually sleep standing up, and that would cost you 2 pence. You could actually have a bed for the night, and that would cost you 4 pence. And if you had a wife with you, you could hire a double bed for 8 pence. But these DOS houses would be full of fleas.
Ugh.
You'd wake up scratching and itching, and they weren't very, very nice places whatsoever. One of the local journalists from the London Evening Standard mentioned he'd been in Whitechapel to look at this terrible housing conditions and saw 40 women, all naked, standing in one line in one of the DOS houses, waiting to use a tin bath with the same water that had been used by 40 women previously.
Ugh.
On their backs, there looked to be a lot of blood, and he thought, have these women been badly treated? But actually, it was bed bugs that had bitten them so badly, they'd scratched so much they'd even scratched the skin. So conditions there were terrible. Now, the only relief from this horrible poverty was alcohol, and you could buy a tumbler, a glass of gin, for 3 pence. Now, 3 glasses of gin a day would keep you inebriated. Now, these so-called ladies of the night, their jobs were horrible. You never knew who you were going to meet. You could meet a man in his 80s or a young man in his 20s. And of course, these poor women had to service them down alleyways, in backyards. It was a dangerous job, a horrible job. And the only thing that would give you any form of relief would be alcohol. Polly Ann Nichols was staying at a doss house. She'd been drinking quite heavily that day, the 31st of August, 1888. And as she made her way back to the doss house, she thought she could just slip in without paying because she had no money. However, the gentleman who ran that doss house said, "You're not coming in here. You're going out right away. If you ain't got no money, you're not staying here." So she made her way outside. And as she walked down what's called Bucks Row, she came across another prostitute called Emily Holland. And Emily said, "Are you okay, Polly?" "No, not really. I ain't got no money. I'm going to go into the town of City of London and find myself some work, and I'll soon have some money to get me head down. And also, I've got a lovely new bonnet on, and I look quite attractive tonight." She made her way into Whitechapel. At around 1:30 in the morning, someone slipped out of the shadows and cut her throat from left to right, nearly severing her head. Her body fell to the floor, her skirt was lifted up, and a knife was inserted into her groin, which went right from her groin, right up to the sternum, and then this person just disappeared. About 20 minutes later, a police constable of the Metropolitan Police called P.C. Neal came across the body and thought there's nothing new here. This is the third prostitute that's been murdered on this very, very row. A month later, a Martha Tabrin had been murdered and an Emma Smith had been murdered. However, in this case, Polly Ann had been mutilated. The body was taken to the local workhouse, stripped naked, and there Dr. Llewellyn of the police surgeon arrived and was horrified to find these injuries were quite horrific. She'd had organs actually removed from her body, her kidney, and quite horrifically, her uterus had been removed professionally. Now, word filtered through Whitechapel that another murder had taken place, and living in Whitechapel was a gentleman called George Lusk. He was a local-born man. He had been the mayor of Whitechapel for a while, and like his fellow locals, he had no love whatsoever for this Jewish community that seemed to want to take over the whole of Whitechapel. And he blamed these murders on the local Jewish population that were indeed hiring these young girls as a business, if you will. However, he was also very, very concerned with the Metropolitan Police because they weren't doing anything. The police did not like going into Whitechapel because it was a very nasty place. In fact, when they did have patrols, they wouldn't come in ones, they'd come in groups of four, armed to the teeth with truncheons and indeed firearms. However, our second murder was going to take place on the 7th of September, 1888. A young lady of the name of Anne Chapman. Anne had been drinking very, very heavily in the Britannia public house, and like her fellow prostitutes, she was drowning her sorrows. She too had had a very, very unhappy marriage. She'd been married to a coachman from Windsor Castle who actually worked for Queen Victoria. But like Polly, she had a love for alcohol. She had for a while been a sieve maker, and she had also tried to sell flowers at Spitalfields Market, but there wasn't much money in that, so she turned to prostitution. As she made her way to a place called Berners Street, she saw a gentleman with a deerstalker hat on and a long brown coat. Nearby was a lady of the name of Elizabeth Long. She was walking to work to Spitalfields Market, and she became the very, very first witness to actually see what we now call Jack the Ripper. As she walked past, she heard the words, "Will you?" "Yes, I will," said Chapman. And Elizabeth made her way to Spitalfields Market. In the meantime, Anne Chapman took this mysterious man into a backyard in what we call an alley behind 29 Berners Street. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, a gentleman called John Donats, a Romanian Jew, went into his backyard to relieve himself, to urinate, and he heard a thump from behind the wooden fencing. He had no idea, but he was standing just 2 yards from Jack the Ripper. At first light, a gentleman called John Evans came down from upstairs of 29 Berners Street, a house where 28 people were living, and saw the body of Anne Chapman lying in the backyard. Her legs were wide open. Her intestines were lying on her right shoulder, and the Metropolitan Police were called in immediately. Inspector Chandler of the Metropolitan Police arrived and looked at this horrible, horrible sight and saw the entrails over the shoulder, the uterus removed, the left kidney removed, and at the foot of Anne were 3 coins. So robbery had not been the intention. Also, by her side was indeed a letter from a soldier in the Essex Regiment, which contained 3 little pills. Now, Anne had been quite seriously ill. She had a lung disorder, and she had been an alcoholic for many, many, many years. So Inspector Chandler arrived, and he was quite horrified to see that people in the street opposite were actually hiring their rooms out so that people could look down at the murder scene. George Lusk, the local mayor, was disgusted with the police because this was a 4th murder in the area and the police weren't taking a real interest. And he said, "This is not fair. You don't care about those people in Whitechapel." And he organised what's called the Whitechapel Vigilante Group, where locals would arm themselves and start to patrol the whole of the Whitechapel area at night time. This did annoy the police very much indeed, because they were taking the law into their own hands. But George Lux said, "Look, you're not doing your job properly. You don't come into Whitechapel, you're not doing your job properly, so therefore we shall take the law into our own hands." The police commissioner was called Sir Charles Warren, and he was getting a lot of criticism in the local press. Stories like, "Metropolitan Police, no good. Metropolitan Police, not worth the rates we pay them. No nearer to catching this maniac." George Lusk then received a letter in red ink from a person called Jack the Ripper, informing him, "You're no nearer to catching me, Mr. Lusk. That last woman I took out, she screamed beautifully, but no one heard her. Yours sincerely, Jack the Ripper." This letter got into the London Evening Standard, and all of a sudden, not only London, but the world took a great interest. This person had somehow come out of the shadows, murdered these women, but did it under the very, very noses of people sleeping only yards away. Whoever he was very quick, He was very fast. He had a knowledge of the area, but also uh, he had knowledge of human anatomy. To remove a uterus perfectly demanded skill, and the knife he used was very, very, very sharp, almost like a surgeon's knife. So the Whitechapel area is now on full alert, but the Metropolitan Police are getting a lot of criticism. The 30th of September, we now go to what's called the night of the double murder. At a place called Dutfield's Yard, only 80 yards off Gloucester Street in Whitechapel, a 40-year-old girl is walking, 40-year-old young lady rather, called Elizabeth Stride. Now, Elizabeth is the only one from outside the United Kingdom to lose her life. She's actually from Gothenburg, Sweden. She's called Lizzie Stride. She had been a professional prostitute in Sweden, and she had left her husband. She had been treated for venereal disease in Sweden, and she arrived in a place called Dungeness in Kent, a county in the south of England, and married a shipwright of the name of John Stride, who was 40 years her senior. When he became a little bit too old to, shall we say, satisfy her, she left and she made her way to the city of London. For a while, the Swedish church in Whitechapel looked after her, but she thought, no, I'm going to go back to my old trade. On the 30th of September, 1888, she walked down Gloucester Street into Dutfield's Yard. There, a gentleman called Israel Schwarzer, he was a Russian Jew, and he saw a gentleman wearing a deerstalker hat with a long brown coat on, having an argument with this lady very near the entrance to Dutfield's Yard. And he could see it was quite a heated exchange of words, actually shouting and swearing. So therefore he crossed the road, but he had no idea, just like Elizabeth Long, he was indeed a very, very key witness to this person we now call Jack the Ripper. At exactly 1 o'clock, a Romanian Jew, the name of Dumscheltz, John Dumscheltz. He was a very, very clever man. He had his own business in the city of London. He was indeed a gold and diamond jeweler. He also owned a bar which he'd built at Dutfield's Yard, but just for the local Jewish community. As his horse and trap made its way inside Dutfield's Yard, the horse reared and was startled by someone. Dumschultz got off his cab, and there in the dim, dim light, he could see a body lying in the yard. He lit a match and saw the body of Lizzie Stride laying prone there. Of course, he rushed inside thinking it was his wife, but his wife was actually serving people in the local club. They all came outside, and the Metropolitan Police arrived very, very quickly. They identified her as Elizabeth Stride, and she was known really as Lucky Liz. Why was she called Lucky Liz? Well, she only had 2 incisions to her neck. It seems that Louis Dumscheltz had somehow startled Jack the Ripper, and he didn't have enough time to remove her organs. However, our murderer, Jack the Ripper, thought, I'll go and find another victim. He needed blood. He made his way for the very, very first time from Whitechapel through the Ginnels, through the Snickelways, through the alleys, and actually into the city of London. Half an hour later, he came across probably the saddest of all our victims, a lady called Catherine Eddowes. Now, Catherine came from a town called Wolverhampton in the English Midlands. She'd been working in the hop fields of Kent. When I say hop fields, you need hops to make beer. And she'd been a hop collector in Kent. But as the first frosts were coming, she made her way up to the city of London. And of course, she knew she could make money as a prostitute. Like all our victims, she had a love for alcohol. She was severely inebriated on the afternoon of the 30th of September, 1888, and had been found at a place called Mitre Square in London, which still exists this very, very day. There, she was arrested by the local police, and taken to the police cells as a precaution. There, she was told to sober. However, she was still inebriated by 1:30 in the morning when Sergeant John Knox of the City of London Police thought, "I'll throw her out." He opened a cell door and threw her onto the streets of London. Still inebriated, she made her way into Mitre Square. As she made her way into Mitre Square, three Jewish gentlemen, John Lavander, William Levi, and also John Hull, were making their way through Mitre Square, and they saw her talking to a gentleman in a deerstalker hat with a long brown cape, but holding what looked like a package wrapped up in newspaper, quite a long package. And Lavander took a great interest because he was going to play a very, very important role in the later witnesses that were brought to the City of London courts. He said to his friend John Levi, "This place is getting dangerous." And the three of them made their way across Mitre Square to cross the other side of the square. Now, Mitre Square is still there to this very, very day. And police constable John Ackroyd of the City of London Police was patrolling the area. He would walk right round the square. It took him 7 minutes to walk around the square. As poor Catherine entered the square, he actually walked past Catherine and said, "Are you okay, dear? I've had a few beers," she said, "but I'm all right." "Well, on your way, my love," he said. As soon as she walked past him, someone came out of the shadows. That person was Jack the Ripper. He cut Catherine's throat from left to right without making a single noise. Only 40 feet away was the police officer. He had his back to the murderer, and he was walking right round the square. In those 7 minutes before the officer came back to the scene of the crime, he had removed her uterus beautifully. He had removed her left kidney. He cut the end of her nose off and made 2 incisions under both eyes, and then disappeared into the night, taking the organs with him. As the police officer came round, he was horrified to see the body of Catherine lying at his feet, and realised that whilst his back had been turned, the Ripper had indeed been committing the murder. What was also quite surprising is that living around the murder scene were over 400 people that didn't hear a single noise. The Ripper then escaped from Mitre Square back into Whitechapel. Now, the whole of Whitechapel was on full alert for the murder of Elizabeth Stride, and somehow the murderer had got back from the City of London and back into Whitechapel without being seen by over the whole of the Metropolitan and City of London police. Well over 2,000 officers. For the very, very first time, the City of London police were brought in because this murder had taken place in London. And just like police forces in America, you had town police, county, and city police. The City of London police were very, very annoyed. This murder had taken place in their patch. And police officer John Williamson rushed towards the crime scene and saw a horse trough still swirling with the freshly washed blood that had come from Catherine's body. A few yards away, he saw her apron that had been ripped off her body and used to clean the knife. And beneath the piece of apron that was heavily, heavily bloodstained were the words written in chalk on a brick wall. The words were, "The Jews are not the men that will be blamed for anything." And he immediately contacted his commissioner, and the City of London commissioner, Lieutenant Colonel John Pauline of the City of London Police, arrived and thought, "My goodness me, that's important information. Let's get our police photographer to take a photograph of this graffiti." However, Sir Charles Warren arrived of the Metropolitan Police and said, "Oh no, that graffiti needs to be wiped out of the way. We'll have a riot in the hands tomorrow. If the Jewish people get blamed for this, we'll have a riot." Now, the two commissioners argued. However, Charles Warren's men rubbed out the graffiti, but the City of London police wrote down the information, and that's why we have this information. There was no love between the Metropolitan and City of Police, and they argued for many, many years about the graffiti being removed. However, by now, the world had been alerted to Jack the Ripper. Who was he? Where did he come from? What was his lust? What we do know is the man was very, very evil and very, very, very dangerous. For 3 long weeks, the Metropolitan Police and City of London were on full alert, and they were about to slow down the the, uh, the patrols when another terrible, terrible murder was going to take place on the 7th of November, 1888, at a place called Miller's Court, not too far from where all the other murders took place. And there was a very, very beautiful young lady called Mary Kelly. Mary was from Ireland. She was the youngest of all our victims, and by all accounts, a very attractive young lady. She'd come from Ireland. She had lived in Wales for a while. There she'd met a young lad called John Kelly. John Kelly was a miner and had been killed in a mining accident at the age of 23. And so Mary thought, I'll try the City of London. When she arrived in the city, she found work quite hard, but she did not find the work of being a prostitute very hard. And she was the only one of our victims to actually have her own accommodation. Now, we're now going to cover probably the best witness story of this terrible, tragic event. A gentleman called John Hutchinson. Hutchinson was 28 years old, and he is the only person ever to have seen into the eyes of Jack the Ripper. He knew Mary quite well, and he knew that she was a professional prostitute. And just occasionally, Mary had serviced him for free, and he would wait until all her clients had left, and then he would go and knock on the door, and if she was feeling in a good mood, she would indeed service him free because she quite liked him. He was a young man. Hutchinson waited in the alleyway with a pea soup fog around his ankles, and there in the dim lights he saw Mary with a gentleman wearing a top hat, a cape, a walking stick, and a bag which looked a bit like a doctor's bag. He knelt down to tie his shoe and looked up and caught the face of this man who had a pencil-thin moustache with wax at both ends. And he was obviously, as he called him, a toff, a very, very wealthy person. He saw them go into number 7 Miller's Court, and Hutchinson waited outside for half an hour, and then he thought, it's getting too late. I'll go home. If he'd waited, he could have not only saved Mary, but also grappled with Jack the Ripper. Inside 7 Miller's Court, a terrible, terrible crime is taking place. Remember, surrounding that accommodation are over 800 people within just yards away. The Ripper grabs Mary, cuts her throat from left to right. He's not just happy with that. He decides to skin the entire body, removing all the flesh and then removing organs and throwing the organs all around the room. An absolute bloodbath. To make sure he can see what he's doing, he removes all her clothes and throws the clothes into the fireplace and lights a fire to illuminate the room quite beautifully. He then disappears into the night. The following morning, the landlord, John Boyer, arrived on the scene to get the rent. He saw a broken window, the door was locked, and he looked into the broken window, and there he saw this horrible sight of the body that had been completely stripped of all its flesh. He was violently sick. The Metropolitan Police arrived with Inspector Aberline and Sergeant John Teague, and both men were violently sick. It was the most horrible of all the murders. However, with this murder, the murders ceased. Well, the suspects, there are many, and crime reporters from across the world, Scotland Yard, the FBI have all been involved, and the six main suspects are as follows. One of them was an American doctor called John Tumblety. Now, John Tumblety was 52 years old, and he came from Nebraska. He was a professional doctor. We know that he was in London at the time of all the murders. And what makes him a suspect is that he had lots of female organs in jars. He had a dislike for females, and at dinner parties, he would bring out these items in preservation fluid, mainly the uteruses. He was, for some strange and macabre reason, obsessed with uteruses. And according to the courts in London, he had been to St. Thomas's Hospital in London and asked if he could buy some uteruses. So therefore, he was a suspect. Now, the City of London Police, Metropolitan Police were involved, but for the very, very first time, they brought in Scotland Yard, which is basically Britain's equivalent of the FBI. Sir Charles Macnaghten was very, very interested in Dr. Tumblety. We do know that Tumblety was interviewed and told to remain at his hotel in London. In the dead of night, he escaped house arrest and made his way down out of the City of London to Southampton, over to Paris, and then from Paris, he booked his passage back to America. Another suspect, most unusual suspect, is indeed Prince Leopold Victor. He was indeed Queen Victoria's grandson, a member of the royal family. We do know that he died of syphilis. We do know that he was a regular visitor to Whitechapel. And the theory is that he had an illegitimate child. And there's no way the royal family would ever accept an illegitimate child born to a prostitute. It has been said, but never ever confirmed, that Polly Ann Nichols, Anne Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Margaret Kelly, and Catherine Eddowes knew about this child and looked after the child. And because they knew about the child, on the order of the royal family, they all had to be executed. And what has amazed a lot of Ripper people that have found the story fascinating, a lot of Ripper journalists, is that no one heard any sound whatsoever. And could the bodies have been dumped at these locations? That's just another theory. Another theory is a Romanian Jew called Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski worked at Spitalfields Market. He had a hatred for women. He also worked as a butcher and had access to butcher's knives. He knew Whitechapel very, very well. He knew all the ginnels, all the snickleways, and he knew how to get from Whitechapel into central London. Certainly, after the last murder, he was found eating food from the gutter and was actually put into a mental asylum. He was interviewed by Scotland Yard, and they brought in Elizabeth Long, George Hutchinson, John Levan, and the three main witnesses, and indeed Louis Dumschultz. And it has said that because Kosminski was a Jew, the fellow Jewish witnesses, because of their religion, could not testify against him. This, again, is just another theory. Scotland Yard's main suspect was a gentleman by the name of John Druitt. John Druitt was a homosexual. He had a hatred for women. He was also a failed doctor. His father, William Druitt, ran a very, very successful surgery in Whitechapel. And of course, he had access to his father's surgical equipment. He was a failed medical student. He was in a depressed state. And certainly, he knew Whitechapel very, very well. What made him a suspect is that the very, very night that Margaret Kelly was murdered, he disappeared. His body was found a month later in the River Thames. and was identified due to um, his wallet, which had his name inside the wallet. And Scotland Yard believed that he was indeed his man. What we find amazing is that none of us really know who Jack the Ripper was. What we do know is he must have been a very, very sadistic and evil person, but highly professional in the fact that he could murder under the very, very eyes of the police and in densely, densely populated areas. Who was Jack the Ripper? Well, we shall never know.
It's an amazing story. One of the mysteries for all time. And if I had to pick one, as much as I've read about it, I couldn't. You know,
No, I couldn't either. I
yeah,
couldn't either.
it's absolutely amazing. What wonderful stories tonight, Simon. I hope this won't be the first time that you come on Journey Through the Gate. You will come back, will you not?
I would absolutely love to. It's always a pleasure to
Oh, gosh.
be on the show. Thank you ever so
Oh,
much.
you're so
I do have
welcome.
a
Please
I do
tell.
have a book
Go,
called Ghostly Tales of the
yes.
Unexpected.
Yes.
You can buy that, of course, on Amazon and Kindle. And I am writing a second book. And but so what I would love to see really is Steven Spielberg get his teeth into the Pendle Witch story because
Oh,
it would
yes.
make a great Hollywood movie because you have everything you'd associate with a Hollywood drama.
Well, I hope they use you as a consultant. Do you
That'd
hear
be
that,
great. That'd
Steven
be
Spielberg? If you're listening, that you got to get a hold of Simon here. Absolutely. And for they want to hear more stories too. I know you do Paranormal UK. Do you do?
that's right.
Yes. Is it every third Thursday? Tell us about that, just so they can listen.
It is indeed. As I say, I am a tour guide, but I also love telling stories. And
Yes.
as we all know, ghostly tales do get the attention of people across the planet, really. And I have just an hourly show every month, and there's nothing I like more than settling down and reading a story. And what is really nice is that I do get letters from across the globe, really, mainly, of course, from the English speaking countries like the USA, like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and indeed South Africa. And it's nice to get a good response, which is lovely, really.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, it's not going to be long before we have you back on. I've already
Thank you.
thinking about having you back on for Halloween for sure, so don't book too many. Thank you
That'd be
so much, Simon. You go have a lovely day. And now, on my side of across the pond, I have to go to sleep now, so I don't think I'm going to get a very good night's sleep tonight after talking with you. But thank you so, so very much, love.
the pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.